join us up.
The PlayStation 1 era was a great time for RPGs. There were tons of innovative games that came out. We saw the Persona series and the Suikoden series get started. We saw Star Ocean 2, Legend of Legaia, Grandia, and a ton more. During this time, Squaresoft was going through sort of a renaissance, and as part of that, we saw 3 entries into the main Final Fantasy series. There was 7, 8, and 9. The first of those games, Final Fantasy VII, marked a major return to the United States for the series, and it was the first time we got a Final Fantasy sequel with its true number. So let's talk about Final Fantasy IX for a minute. It was clear with this game they wanted to do something different from the steampunk stuff they did in previous games. The Black Mage makes a return to this game as the character Vivi, and the dungeons and cities have much more of a nature-y sort of feel to it. High technology still plays a role in the airships, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it was in the previous 2 games. The princess wears a robe which makes her look like the White Mage from the first game. There's an airship just like in previous games, and so on. This was definitely designed to perk the senses of older gamers and spark the recognition of those older elements. Even the towns look a little bit more like they used to back in the NES games. So let's take a look. Number 1, the first hour. Final Fantasy games are large in nature. The stories tend to take on the form of the drawn-out epic style. They each span multiple discs and they take a real time investment to play to the end. I'd love to break these games down bit by bit, but minding my limitations, I want to focus primarily on the first hour of gameplay. The hook for a long game is oh so important, especially in the PS1 era, when loading times were all over the place. So a prime example of a hook being used properly in storytelling would be the book Executive Orders. Oh man, that's pretty big. It's got all kinds of pages and all words and stuff, but in the first 30 pages or so, the White House gets destroyed, Jack Ryan becomes the President of the United States, several characters and their motivations are clearly established. That's a hook. Makes you want to read the next several pages. So, Final Fantasy IX's hook is just as well done. Here we see the main character as Zidane, and he's established as a bandit in the first few minutes of the game. That's right, you get to play as a kidnapping, thieving piece of garbage. Or at least that's how they set it up. So a ragtag band of thieves sets out to kidnap a princess who, by coincidence, is looking to run away. The plan is to put on a major theater production as a high-profile diversion. The whole thing culminates in a really beautifully written scene. The hero shows up and woos the princess, but it's sort of like a fake wooing. The whole thing's just a distraction to aid in her abduction, and yet it's one of those moments where the things he says, despite being a total lie, end up being a reflection of what's true. It's a great scene, and I especially love the part where you're staging a fight scene in a play. This might be the only appropriate use of QuickTime events I've ever seen. QuickTime events always to me feel like I'm not really playing the game, but in this scene you're not really fighting, so the mechanic fits. So, with the success of kidnapping the princess, or aiding in her escape, however you want to look at it, our story begins to unfold. The hook is set. Number 2, the characters. So we mentioned Zidane begins the game as a crook. This is something we see vanish from his character arc rather quickly, but I really enjoyed starting off as part of the bad guys. Zidane's a man of the world. He's been places, he's done things, probably got a bunch of good stories from the barroom, and he knows people. We see this several hours into the game when the character Freya is introduced as just someone Zidane knew, you know, from before the game got started, when he was doing stuff in his life. So anyway, let's take a look at our antagonists. In that first hour, it's important for us to sympathize with thieves, so in order to accomplish this, the Queen was made to be a complete over-the-top mess. Look at this lady. Now the clever thing about this character design is that it gets us to immediately root for the princess's escape without having to ever explain anything about her treatment or why she wants to escape. The madness of the Queen is enough to drive the first hour of the game forward without having to waste even a single line of dialogue. Because reading sucks. Don't like reading. Don't want to have to read. So then we come to Vivi, who is sort of an enigma in an otherwise tightly wrapped first hour. Vivi has a childlike nature, which gives the player something to relate to in the middle of all the chaos. In that first hour, he's portrayed as a kid who just wants to watch the show. And until the first dungeon area in the woods, that's more or less the entire role he plays. And one of the great things about Vivi is that his ability to use magic in combat is worked into the story. He's a character who has a mysterious power to control fire. This is done as opposed to just having a combat ability called fire that's never discussed or never really given any reason why it's there. Then there's Steiner. Steiner's a perfect example of the words over the top. He's pure of heart, incorruptible, and totally incompetent. While he mostly plays the role of the clown, his sense of duty sets up for a constant clash against the mischievous nature of the protagonist. Then when he joins your party, he ends up being the hardest hitter in the bunch, so imagine that. I want to keep this more or less on the topic of the first hour, but I think it's important to mention Quina. No one likes this character. I don't know why they felt the need to add a scary chef monster who eats frogs, but yeah, that's a thing that's in the game. Remember Cat Sith from Final Fantasy VII? I think the goal of Quina was for this game to have its own version of Cat Sith. I don't know, it seems kinda lame to me, but that's okay. It's a long game. Number 3, the art style. Final Fantasy IX, when taken into the context of the series, took the art style in a different direction. The previous two games showed a trend of crafting more realistic models, starting with Final Fantasy VII's cartoony, crude hands, which were pretty cool for their time, and improving in Final Fantasy VIII's more realistic look. It feels more like a puppet show. Everything is exaggerated, and the characters all look more like caricatures of what they're supposed to be. Also, it's worth noting that the ratio of fantasy to steampunk is tipped way more towards fantasy than in previous games. I think this is a good idea. Midgar from Final Fantasy VII is tough to beat when it comes to a steampunk setting. Also, the first hour featured excellent use of full motion video. It's fed to the player in small doses. You're not asked to sit and watch huge scenes without having any input. I think this is more due to the technical limitations of size and space in the PS1, but its effect as a result is a much more balanced experience. The game never seems to forget that it's a game, and the player is supposed to play it even when it's feeding us the story. Number 4, the story. In 2000, when this game came out, a lot of great RPGs for the PS1 had already broken new ground in terms of stories that were far out there. Final Fantasy IX was a game about embracing cliches. There's a princess, you have two kingdoms, Alexandria and Lindblum, which allows politics and looming war to set the stage. There is a character named Cid, like in all previous games. The main character is really girly and feminine. He just walks into people's houses to talk to NPCs and so on. In fact, there's a really long list of RPG cliches you can read up on, and Final Fantasy IX does a really good job of making sure every one of those items is present. This is not to the game's detriment, though. Remember, the point was to celebrate what Final Fantasy, and RPGs in general for that matter, had accomplished up to this point. This is a game about the characters, and I think that might be one of the reasons why people had such a negative reaction to Quina. Just didn't fit the puzzle, I guess. Number 5, the card game. Tetramaster. Yeah, there's this card game you can play in-game as well, a lot like Final Fantasy VIII. Collectible card games as a diversion had been done like this before. Might and Magic 6 had its own collectible card game, I remember. So, let's talk about collectible card games in video games for a minute. See, back in 2000, DLC wasn't around yet, so you had a collectible card game in a video game. All possible attainable cards were programmed in and accessible without having to spend a dime. That's why the Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy Color was so awesome. That's why Magic the Gathering Duels of the Planeswalkers from 1997 was and will always be the best Magic the Gathering video game. Cards were unlocked through skill and a little luck, and ultimately just through playing the game and not shelling out cash. Since microtransactions have become the big thing, these types of games have become extinct. It's far too tempting for developers to make certain cards purchasable in online stores or something like that. Alright, I'm going to go back to Final Fantasy IX now. You ready? Okay, here we go. So they made this card game where you can challenge people to play by pressing square to talk to them instead of pressing X. Cards can be obtained randomly by winning monster battles or by winning the card game. The rules are fairly simple. It's more or less a game about arrow placement. But when two arrows face each other, there's sort of a stats battle. And the way the winner is determined is never fully explained in game. Also, I think it's really missing here that there's no in-game benefit to playing the card game. The card game is essentially optional, and you don't really get any items or anything like that from playing it. Regardless, it was a cool addition. I never played the Tetramaster game extensively, but I did play the occasional challenge just to experience the part of the game. Final Fantasy games weren't cheap back in the day, so I wanted to make sure I got to enjoy the whole package. You can play if you want, but you don't really have to if it's not your thing. Also, the game doesn't let you dig into the card game until about 2 hours in. I think this was set up that way to keep it from interrupting the flow of that ever-important story hook, and ultimately I think that was a good thing. It worked out in the end. By the time you can sit down and play the card game for a couple of hours, you already know who the characters are and what their motivations are. Tetramaster also had its own sort of standalone game where you could play online against other real people, but Squaresoft shut the game down in December 2010, and I didn't find out about it until long after that, so I never got to play it. Number 6, the conclusion. Final Fantasy IX was a great game. It had cool characters, memorable moments, fun extras. It was a great game in a time when there were many great games. PSN's got it for $10, so if you got a PSP or a PS3 or whatever, you can play it for pretty cheap, or you can get a physical copy for about $1 billion. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'll give it a rating of fine Colombian coffee. This is Critical Failure for Tiger Claw TV, signing off.